Today's story of the Transfiguration of Jesus is important to the Christian faith. The fact that it's recorded in all three of the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Gospel of John is off doing its own thing as usual, is a test to its significance, since not even Jesus' birth made it into all three Gospels. Some scholars say the Transfiguration episode is really an account of Jesus' resurrection, which was moved to a different part of the Gospels, while others say no, its roots are in an actual event entirely separate from the resurrection. Wherever it came from, we find ourselves drawn to its mystery and wonder year after year on the last Sunday before the season of Lent. It's a story about a mountaintop experience, a story of how Jesus shed his humanity and appeared in divine glory before the disciples. His face, his clothing, everything about him shining bright as lightning, the gospel writer says. It's a story about how suddenly Moses and Elijah make an appearance, even though they have been dead for centuries. And Luke says they spoke with Jesus about his exodus, which is a delicate way of saying his death. I like to think they offered words of encouragement, assuring him that, this is what he was supposed to be doing with his life. I think we all need to hear that every once in a while from someone we respect and love. It's a story about how Peter, trying to make sense out of something that made no sense, started babbling about setting up some tents, 3 of them, one for Jesus, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. I tend to do that sometimes. Maybe you do too. I tend to try to explain the unexplainable instead of sitting quietly in the mystery of it all. Because sitting in the presence of that which is unknowable and unknown can sometimes be frightening. Maybe that's what the gospel writer was trying to convey when he wrote, "A cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud." And it's a story about how a voice finally speaks to us from that cloud of unknowing. It spoke to Jesus, a voice that identified Jesus as God's own child, God's chosen, God's beloved. The same voice that spoke the same words at the beginning of Jesus' ministry as he rose up from the baptismal waters of the Jordan River. And the voice says one more thing. It says, listen to him. Shut up and listen. Be still and listen. And I can just imagine Peter and James and John looking at each other with their mouths hanging open and a dumb look on their face, and maybe even whispering under their breath to each other, what the hell was that all about? Because it was otherworldly, it was amazing, it was wonderful, and we don't ever want to let it go, because this story not only offers a glimpse of a transfigured Jesus, it also offers a glimpse of the possibility of a transfigured humanity and what that might look like. It's a powerful story, but it's an incomplete story without the verses that follow the Transfiguration. The mountaintop experience is only half the story, because in each of the synoptic accounts, there follows the same conclusion in which Jesus and the disciples descended the mountain, were met by a man with a son who was tormented by random seizures so severe that they caused him to go into convulsions. And after a few choice words, because it's sometimes difficult to re-enter the daily grind of the everyday world after having spent some time transfigured on top of a mountain. After a few choice words, Jesus heals the boy. And that's really, really important. Jesus, you see, didn't stay on top of the mountain. He came back down and got to work, because that's what he was called to do until his exodus, as Luke puts it. He wasn't called to take up residence on top of a mountain. In his own words, the Spirit of God had anointed him to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, and to set free those who are oppressed. And you can't do that on top of a mountain. You have to come down from the mountain. There's a story that may or may not be true. You'll have to decide for yourself. It's a story of a pastor who served a church for over 20 years. It was his first church, and he was excited at its potential after arriving and surveying the old building in which the small group of people met. He was warned about the vandalism that occurred in what was thought to be a bad neighborhood. Make sure to lock your car doors because they will break in and steal from you if you don't, he was told. The church building also had locks everywhere on it. Some doors had several locks. The pantry, which contained nothing more than pots and pans, also had its share of locks. Everywhere there were locks for keeping unwanted trespassers out. The new pastor decided, though, that it wasn't really a bad neighborhood at all, but instead an old neighborhood. There's a difference. But still the members fretted over the pastor, who refused to lock the church door during office hours and would sometimes go so far as to prop the door open as if to welcome any strangers who might be passing by. Sunday worship was important to the small congregation, as it should be. Candles were lit. Long-winded liturgies filled the multi-page bulletin, and verbose prayers were scattered throughout the service. The pastor was seated on what appeared to be a throne that faced the congregation, which made him feel very uncomfortable indeed. And when it came time to celebrate Holy Communion, he would climb the steps to the top level of the sanctuary where the altar was perched, bless the elements, and awkwardly wait as church members made their way up the steps to receive the sanctified elements placed delicately on their tongues. Over time, the pastor began to make changes that made some folks within the congregation uncomfortable. Change often has that effect. The altar was brought down to the same level as the congregation, so there would be no more climbing and tripping up the steps. The throne was put into storage so the pastor could sit in the pews with the rest of the congregation. And gradually, members began to drift away, many finding their place in the Episcopal church down the road, which seemed to be a better match for their worship style than that of the old church in the old neighborhood. The size of the church's congregation never seemed to take off, but its ministry did, as it served marginalized populations that weren't being served by any of the other churches in town. It even began a food ministry focused on the neighborhood's needs, many of whom turning out to be unhoused, and giving the pastor the opportunity to connect with people who were in need. You see, it's only when Peter and the others came down from the mountain and found a father and a child gasping for life that Jesus was able to go about the business of healing. And with that healing, the real transfiguration took place. And it's only when the small church in the old neighborhood unlocked their doors and stepped out into the neighborhood that they began to meet the distress of the surrounding community that was convulsed and mauled by poverty. But that's also when they discovered transfiguration as a congregation in connection with others. But they had to come down from the mountain for it to happen. Mountaintop experiences can be inspirational. They are even sometimes transformational. Those experiences have been known to take place within the four walls of a sanctuary. The music, the liturgy, a heartfelt testimony or prayer can allow a person to bask in the warmth of God's divine glory. But we won't truly know transfiguration until we take that sacred experience out into the world. It's only when we come down from the mountain and begin the work of healing, maybe accompanied with a few choice words, that we experience transformation. Living up high, separate from people who make you uncomfortable, isn't the point of transfiguration. It was never meant to be a private experience of spirituality removed from the public square. It's supposed to be a vision to carry us down, a glimpse of unimagined possibility at ground level. Amen.